I'm G. Rose, and today we're going to be talking about the Socratic Embodiment Part 2. We already talked about in Part 1 how Socrates gives us not merely a method, but a way to embody a certain epistemological position in the world where you don't merely unveil to people that they don't always have justifications or groundings for their beliefs or what they think, but you also participate with them in a way that makes you feel for yourself the lack of an ultimate grounding and uncertainty and all the existential anxiety that comes with it. We're not merely putting other people through that, but you yourself are participating in that. And the terms developing from and developing with were featured in Part 1. And the idea of developing with is generally where, say, you have a problem with alcohol, but you learn to develop with that problem by not putting yourself in a place where alcohol is appealing, or being careful about how much you drank so that you don't, say, become belligerent or something like that. Whereas developing from is kind of like developing from out of, which is to say that you no longer have the desire to drink at all. In Socrates, we see someone who suggests to us that we only develop with, that we need to be with people to really develop intellectually, because you really don't develop intellectually until you feel your positions, or you feel your ideas. And Socrates wants us to be in a place where we feel other people, and that requires being in their presence. We don't really develop deeply if we're away from other people and it's merely an intellectual assent, because ideas are not experience. We don't develop away from people, and likewise we have reason to think that we never completely develop from out of some of our negative tendencies or pathos or human natures or things like that. And the second part is going to be asking questions of, well, what does this mean for the design of a society? If you take seriously the fact that human beings are mostly developing with as opposed to developing from, then the way you do society is going to be different. Now, I don't want to say that it's impossible for people to ever develop from anything. It's certainly possible that a given person can develop from a tendency to lie, or a tendency to get nervous, or imposter syndrome, or things like that. But there's also something to be said about if we treat people as if they're only developing with, say, a desire to drink alcohol or tendency toward alcoholism, then that might fall better into a precautionary principle when we're designing our society. If we treat everyone as if they have developed from alcoholism, then we may not be as careful about where we design bars, where we design things in the location of the store, say the location of the alcohol. We might put it in the front and not think much of it. Whereas if we take seriously the fact that people are developing with a tendency to overdrink, then the way we designed our stores, the way we designed our city would be quite different. And again, I'm not saying that alcohol is bad. Again, everything that exists is good if used in the right order. The issue is that human beings have a potential to disorder things, and we always have a potential to disorder things, and that's a reality we have to develop with. It can be the case that we can develop from out of certain tendencies to disorder, but we probably never entirely develop out of the capacity to disorder at all, unless maybe you're a Jesus or a Buddha, some higher spiritual teacher. It's not something that many of us ever achieve. It is the case that humans are more so a mixture of developing with and developing from. The paper's going to talk about DW and DF. And it's important that when we get to know someone, that we don't treat them as if they're merely developing with everything, because humans do, in fact, develop from things. So on the individual particular level, we can adjust and we can treat people in their particularity in particular ways and differently based on who they are and what they've done. But the issue is on the social level, we may want to emphasize developing with as opposed to developing from, because if someone has indeed developed from, then if we treat them like they're developing with, they're going to be good to go because, they developed from the problem. But if people are developing with a given problem or pathos and we act like they've developed from it, then we might design our society in a way that doesn't address those people very well, and in fact leaves them in a place where their pathos develops, gets out of hand, and causes them a lot of trouble. So on the macro systems level, it's probably quite wise to emphasize developing with. Also, the paper is going to make a point that although everyone on average is a mixture of developing with and developing from, 1 in 3 are the numbers that the paper will designate. DW and DF. So on average, everyone's a mixture. When it comes to particular topics, like when you zoom in on particular topics like alcoholism, like lust, like short-temperedness, or so on and so forth, we're either developed from it or with it. There's really no middle. You don't have a middle. You're either don't desire alcohol anymore or you still do. And if you still do at all, you're developing with it. Now, to the degree you're developing with it, to the degree you're in the DW camp as opposed to lean toward DF, well, that can vary, but when it comes to particular issues, everyone is either a DW, you're either a DW or a DF. So we have to remember that. And this is also important to keep in mind. So that's all to say that you can't really develop a social order. You can't develop an effective policy that treats people like a 2 in particularity, because people either are DW or DF. So you either have to develop a program or system in particularity as one or the other. You can't average it out, even if you can't have an average system per se, even if people on average are a mixture of DW and DF. It's also really important to note that you can receive 100 compliments for how good your song is or your story or whatever you created, and one person says it's bad, and all you do is think about that one person. You can have 10 years of a successful marriage, and then one night where you have a huge argument and the marriage could be over, or there could be things said that take years to recover. Human relations, the human situation is very, very fragile. It takes very little to destroy society. I mean, we see now with supply chain problems how fragile the social order can be. So this is another reason why it can be very good on the systems level to emphasize development with DW as opposed to develop from. Also, if it is the case that all of us have something we're developing with, that none of us are entirely developing from, then all of us in certain areas could be the factor of which causes the system to break. And since the system is fragile, any of us have that power to do something or to start something that could have very large systemic consequences. Now, that being the case, we ought to think of our systems as taking seriously the fact that humans are developing with, not from. Also, if we develop a macro system that is contingent upon people developing from something, say competition or pathos or lust or alcoholism, whatever, it's very unlikely that system is going to work. The system needs to assume that people are only at best developing with certain pathologies. If the system requires people to develop from out of certain pathologies in order for that system to work on the macro level, it is very unlikely to work, simply because on average, it's not going to be the case that everyone has developed from, and because the system, all human systems are fragile, and so it's quite unlikely that you won't have a breakdown there. So on the macro system level, you want to emphasize DW. When you work down to the small communal level, then individuals, they can treat each other differently. They can treat each other like mixtures of DF and DW, and arguably, if you treat me like I have a problem with alcoholism or am developing with a problem with alcoholism and I do not, then I might not feel very addressed. So it is important on the particular and communal level for there to be adjustments relative to the particular people and the particular circumstances that they are in, even if on the macro systems level, you want to have a emphasis on developing with, as opposed to developing from. Another way to put this is we can say ourselves to ourselves, we should assume development with, and that's going to incubate self-skepticism. That's going to help us avoid overconfidence that we think of ourselves as developing with, not developing from. Whereas when we think about others, we assume DW of ourselves and more of a mixture of other people with an emphasis on development from. So we ought to treat people like they have overcome what they've gone through, while they simultaneously treat themselves as DW, and simultaneously we should treat ourselves as DW as they treat us more development from. What we like to do is naturally we like to think of ourselves as DF, while we think of other people as DW, or merely just with, if you will. So we need to reverse that, and that will have positive impacts on relationships. That doesn't mean people will be perfect, and what you do Basically, if the people around you make mistakes, you accept the reality there that they are DW, but you continue to have faith in the possibility of DF until they get to the place where they are just straight up abusive or things like that, and then you would need to move on. But it's important for us to think of ourselves as more DW and to think of others as more DF. On a macro scale, we should assume DW, development with, whereas on a micro scale, we can make space. We should make space for difference between DW and DF. So those would be the four kind of on a systems levels ways of thinking. Now, what all exactly that means, you would have to get into the particulars of the socioeconomic order. You would have to get on into the details of how the community is put together, and so on and so forth. But there is a lot of talk of systems that kind of are put together assuming a certain level of development from a certain level of human, of evolution, or people getting better at this, that, or so forth, or enlightenment. And basically what this paper wants to say is that on the macro level, you want to be very careful about designing a system that will only work if people have reached a certain level of quote-unquote enlightenment, or a certain level of overcoming human nature, or anything like that. That it's much wiser to assume that we are developing with human nature. Now, that doesn't mean we can't get better. Note the keyword development, developing. That is in all these phrases, DW, DF, developing from, developing with. So this is not a stagnant doctrine. We're not saying that there isn't real development, but we always have to, it's wise and prudent to keep in mind that humans are always developing with pathos, as Bard and different people will mention, that humans are always developing with tendencies to become irritable, tendencies to be competitive, mimetic desire, Gerard, etc., so forth, as opposed to thinking about systems as needing to reflect development from, out of mimetic desire, irritation, and things like that. Assuming development from is just begging to have the system fall apart. For more by OG Rose, please visit ogrose.com. You can find us on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, Anchor, things of that nature. And thank you so much for your time.